This week, we start off with a PCI discussion. We're going to be talking about PCI 4.0 with Mr. Jeff Mann and Josh Marpet. Then, from the archives, a Hacker Heroes interview with Win Schwartow. All that and more on this episode of Paul's Security Weekly. This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network. It's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly. When it comes to ensuring your company has top-notch security practices, things can get complicated and time-consuming fast. Now you can assess risk, secure the trust of your customers, and automate compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001, HIPAA, and more with a single platform, Vanta. Vanta's leading trust management platform helps you automate evidence collection, unify risk management, and streamline security reviews. Save hours of work by completing security questionnaires with Vanta AI. Go to securityweekly.com/Vanta to watch their on-demand demo. That's securityweekly.com/VANTA. BreachLock is a global leader in continuous attack surface discovery and penetration testing. Since BreachLock was founded, they are adding over 50 new customers every month. They have discovered over 1 million reported vulnerabilities and performed more than 20,000 pen testing engagements, including pen tests for over 15,000 web applications, 8,000 mobile apps, more than 100,000 APIs, over 10,000 cloud security audits, and over 200,000 network endpoints. They test your entire attack surface and help you mitigate your next cyber breach before it occurs. Know your risk. Contact BreachLock today. Visit securityweekly.com/BreachLock. Coming to you from Purgatory Studios in semi-high definition, compliments of Darth Vader himself, this is Paul's Security Weekly, episode number 825, being recorded on Wednesday, April 17th, 2024. That's actually when it airs. We're actually recording this segment before that. Quick announcement, Security Weekly listeners can save $100 on their RSA Conference 2024 full conference pass. RSA Conference will take place May 6th through the 9th in San Francisco and on demand. Register using our discount code by visiting securityweekly.com/RSAC24 and use the code 54USecWeekly. We hope to see you there. I have with me Mr. PCI himself, Mr. Jeff Mann. Jeff, welcome.
Hey, Paul. Nice to be here to talk about my favorite and least favorite topic.
Woohoo. Yes. Mr. Josh Marpet is here with us as well. Josh, welcome.
Hey, I don't have enough alcohol on hand for this discussion, but I'll make it through.
I know. Same. Jeff's drinking. It's fine.
I'm drinking. I can't not drink.
Jeff, I did. Yeah. I wanted to start off. I don't think we've had this conversation on air, probably not at all in a long time. But I'm just a level set, right? What you do in your day job. So, briefly describe the kind of organizations that need to be PCI compliant, and then what is a QSA, and what is your role, and how do you maintain that certification?
Okay, so my day job, I work for a company called Online Business Systems. The core of the risk, security, and privacy team are people that I've worked with over the years doing PCI. Now going on 20 years for most of us. So we're called in PCI speak a qualified security assessor company, or QSAC. So we have to, as a company, we have to pay to get that privilege, and that's who QSAs, which is what I am, qualified security assessors, are allowed to work for. The governing body for all this is something called the PCI Security Standards Council. So we just call them the council. They set all the rules. They write all the standards for all the different aspects of things going on in the payment industry.
They're the ones that do the satanic rituals and sacrifice small animals on the altars.
Yep,
they were the council.
All of the above.
The cabal, the council, the elders. Just check clarifying. Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
All of the above. That's right. And I'm sure they appreciate you pointing that out for everybody. So a day in the life
don't
of
hurt me.
Yeah, and so but your role is a what is a QSA? Qualified Security
QSA,
Assessor?
Qualified Security Assessor. So in the
Okay.
ecosystem of PCI, we are considered the security experts that come in and evaluate organizations, what PCI generically terms an entity, to see how well they're measuring up to the PCI data security standard, which is now in 4.0, which just became effective April 1st, mostly.
So your job is also like to give advice as well, because as we all know in compliance standards, there's, not everything fits into a nice, square hole kind of thing, right? So
that's right.
There needs to be some discussion, and you're there to provide guidance.
We're very often QSAs are referred to as auditors. A lot of organizations or entities treat us as just the next audit in the queue throughout the year. That a lot of them have to do. I haven't seen SOX lately, but I know it's still out there. A lot of ISOs. Graham Leach Bliley, occasionally HIPAA HITRUST, depending on what the organization is. But yeah, we are the ones that, in theory, interpret how well a company is meeting a requirement. If they're doing something that's not exactly what the requirement states, but they're still kind of meeting the spirit of the requirement, that has to be written up historically in what's called a compensating control. Right. Although now in version 4, there's a new concept that they're introducing. We can get into that in more detail in a little bit, but there's a new option as opposed to compensating controls, which gives organizations. Compensating controls are meant to be or intended to be temporary stopgaps until you can actually meet the requirement. There's now a concept of, well, no, if you're just going to have an alternate approach, you're doing something differently, and that's how you're going to do it. They've come up with this new concept called customized approach, which requires a little bit of legwork in terms of you're basically coming up with your own criteria for how do you evaluate to make sure that this is meeting the requirement, and you're doing all the things, configuring all the things, tracking all the things associated with whatever the customized approach is, so that I, as a QSA, can come in and assess sort of a companion set of requirements that's not actually written in the standard, but is documented so that you have to follow it, and I know you have to follow it. That's completely new, and nobody's done that yet.
Do you have to recertify every year, Jeff, to maintain that status? Is there like a certification associated with it?
To be a QSA?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, that's an annual certification, and along with that, continuing education credits.
How many CPs?
Oh gosh. Well, the council got smart a few years back because they require you to maintain not one but 2 industry certifications, one that's sort of focused on security and one that's focused, unfortunately, on audit. And they finally figured out, well, if you have to maintain CPEs to maintain your certifications in order to be a QSA, they sort of grandfather it in. So there is no longer a specific CPE requirement for PCI. It's sort of implied because you have to maintain 2 certifications to stay a QSA. So what's left is you pay your annual fee and you have to take a recertification exam. Go through a training course or refresher course, then take the exam every year.
Gotcha.
Okay. That's not bad.
And so,
that's pretty
now
legit.
There's different tiers of merchants. What's the big difference between the various tiers?
There's 4 levels of merchants and that's determined by the major card brands, Visa, MasterCard, American Express, Discover, and other ones that are more European and Asian based. 4 levels. Level 1 merchant, who traditionally are the ones that get to have a QSA come in and do a full report on compliance. Depending on the card brand, it's either 5 or 6 million transactions per year. What I usually try to tell people is the Visa requirement is 6 million Visa transactions a year. And Visa historically has owned about 60% of the credit card market. So do the math. That means as an organization, you're doing about 10 million credit card or debit card transactions a year. That puts you into the level 1 category. Level 2 is sort of the next tier down, and that's between 1 million transactions up to the 5 or 6 million. And historically, those smaller companies are allowed to do self-assessment questionnaire. MasterCard, for a brief period a couple years ago, demanded that level 2 merchants have a QSA come in and do a full ROC, and that didn't last very long. They backed off from that, but they strongly encourage you to engage a QSA. So I actually, and a lot of people in our practice, do a lot of work with smaller merchants and even service providers, which is the other category we'll get to in a minute, helping them fill out their self-assessment questionnaire and making sure they're going through the paces, making sure it's more than just that famous checkbox exercise that we've all heard about. So that's level 2.
Do all the tiers need to have a scanning component by a qualified scanning vendor?
So it's sort of a trick question, and let me just speak in the context of version 4. The requirement to have an external scan of your internet-facing systems associated with your payment, whatever it is, stuff, or your e-commerce, if that's all you do. That is a requirement by the card brands, and the last time I checked, version levels 1, 2, and 3 require a scan for its discretionary. Now, where it gets tricky, though, is new in version 4 of PCI is a new set of self-assessment questionnaires. And for e-commerce only, the short form SAQ-A is the one that you're qualified to use if basically you outsource your payment page to a third party and you redirect or use an iframe, is what's very common these days, so that none of that, somebody's purchasing something, they're typing in all their payment information. It's not going into any of your systems. It's going right to the third party. If you do that, historically, all you had to do was basically validate that you're using a PCI validated third party, that the iframe is in place, the redirect's in place. You're not ever seeing electronically any payment card data. Now, in version 4 of the SAQ-A, they have added an ASV scanning requirement for your web server, because they're trying to make sure that there's some sort of security done to that server, even though there's no payment information. And
someone
that's
could
come
hijack
about
it. We've seen it.
Well, it's come about largely what we call web skimming, or there's a hacking group called MageCard. So it's commonly referred to as a MageCard attack. Session hijacking, focused more on the browser and the client side experience, which isn't looked at. So while the card brands have said historically a small merchant level 4, and maybe they're only doing e-commerce, don't have to do an ASV scan, if they're filling out SAQ or really any of the SAQs, now you do. So that's one of the probably biggest changes to, in my opinion, for version 4, is that there's a lot of e-commerce only merchants out there that have never had to do any kind of technical testing, haven't had to do much. A lot of them outsource their web server, or it's hosted somewhere else. All of a sudden there's this requirement for an ASV scan, and it's still kind of sorting out who's in charge of the scan, who's running the scan, who's responsible for the scan. But on paper, it's the merchant that's filling out the SAQ and the companion attestation, and that requires them to do ASV scans. The other thing that's interesting is, traditionally, new requirements that are introduced in version releases, you get a year grace period to sort of warm up to it. Not so with the ASV scan for this SAQ-A merchant. It's a requirement right now. So and because it's a quarterly requirement starting April 1st, you've got 90 days to produce a clean ASV scan for whenever it is your anniversary that you're self-assessing, whether it's
a quarterly
or not.
And that's a quarterly scan that you're required to do?
You're required to produce a passing scan quarterly.
Gotcha.
Most companies are scanning more often than that. They'll
Yeah, to
sign
keep
up
up with
for
it. Right.
an unlimited service, or they're scanning monthly or weekly. Heck, I've had e-commerce clients in the past that scan every day because
Sure.
that's their bread and butter.
Yeah.
And for those that are focused on it and doing it right, they generally don't have a problem passing the scans because they're on top of keeping things patched and
Yeah, like
keeping things configured correctly.
I used to run NetSparker
Oh,
against
wow.
my websites, and the management and of that scanning platform was really good. I really like. They were sponsored for a long time. I really liked working with that platform, and it really did have that workflow of it could scan a website every day. It would do the diff. It sends you a report. It tracks all the things, and I believe, like, I gotta imagine that they're a QSV, right? That they're a qualified scanning
ASV.
vendor for PCI or ASV.
Hey,
Well,
real quickly to finish your question. So level 1 is over 6 million. Level 2 is 1 to 6 million. Level 3, e-commerce only, for some reason. All the brands say that it's 50,000 up to $1 million. And then level 4 is 50,000 and below transactions.
Mhm.
Slight
what
variations
happens?
per card brand.
Wait. What happens if you're not an e-commerce vendor and you
Right.
have 100,000 transactions? That's per month or per year? Sorry.
Well, I guess technically if you're not e-commerce and you're below 1 million transactions, then you're level 4. So level 4
Okay.
is non-e-commerce up to 1 million, but if it's e-commerce, it's up to 50,000.
Okay. That actually
Last time I looked.
valid. And that's sorry, again, that's per month or per year?
Per year.
Per year. Okay.
And per specific card brand. It's not the aggregate of all of them.
So if I'm e-commerce and have 49,000 Visa, 49,000 MasterCard, 49,000 Discover, I'm level 4, even though in aggregate I am over the 50,000 transaction.
In theory, yep.
Okay. Interesting.
Yep.
Interesting.
And for smaller merchants, I know I had some experiences with a cigar lounge that I helped out with PCI compliance, and they've got one IP address.
Right.
They're not e-commerce, and basically everything was in scope because it's all on the same network. It's all going through the same firewall, and it's one IP address. I'm assuming that's standard practice.
Well, more or less standard practice. For the self-assessment questionnaires, there's 9 different versions, and they're split up primarily by the payment acceptance method. So SAQ-A's, and there's 2 versions of it, are e-commerce related. SAQ-B, and there's 2 versions. There's B and B-IP. That's more for, and I haven't seen one of these in forever, but a small shop that has a dial-up to get the authorization, or they use some sort of terminal to do but it's either connected directly to a phone line. Like if you go to, if there's still red boxes around anywhere, to rent videos, they've got their own little antenna on top. They basically have their own cell phone inside, and they're connecting straight out. So that's an SAQ-B type of scenario. So direct connection, either B is through the phone line, or IP, it could be internet connected, but it's just a payment terminal. You're swiping, dipping, and it's going straight out, not traversing your network. SAQ-C, and again, there's 2 versions, C and C-VT, which stands for virtual terminal. You're using, a payment terminal that's a PC essentially, and it's either a custom kind of a terminal, or it can be an application, web application based on on your tablet, desktop, laptop, directly internet connected, but not networked. And of course, lots of people have networks, and so that's when you start doing network isolation or segmentation to keep them isolated, so they're not, any of the card data is not traversing any other part of your network. And then finally, there's 2 versions of SAQ-D, and that's sort of the whole enchilada. If you don't qualify for one of the short forms, you do the full 1040 basically. And there's a version for merchants, and there's also a version for service providers. Here's the other big change that we've unfortunately just realized, because I'm engaged with a service provider helping them fill out their SAQ-D. New
Now,
in version 4.
Sorry, Jeff.
Mhm.
Define a service provider in this context.
Oh, I'm sorry. So merchants are the ones where payments are happening.
Yep.
A service provider, by definition, is any third party that's involved in any way, shape, or form or connected to the merchant, the payment acceptance path, doing any kind of support. It could be a colo, it could be a hosting provider, it could be an outsourced IT provider, it can be a security provider that's doing managed firewalls or managed intrusion detection or managed incident response. But it's whoever's providing the internet connectivity, whoever's doing the hosting. It could be somebody that's intercepting the transactions, doing fraud detection. It's a very broad. Anybody. It's the actual definition is any organization that could impact or the security of the transmission, processing, or storage of credit card data. So they're either doing any of those or could impact the security of the card data. It's a very broad category.
Yeah.
And over the years, the card brands, I think MasterCard's really honestly done the best job of defining sort of different categories of service provider to determine whether they are eligible to do their own self-assessment questionnaire. So there's a lot of third parties we're involved with that it's kind of incidental contact.
Yeah.
And I can give you a couple examples and other ones that are, we're really involved in the processing. We're really passing the data along and we're seeing all of it. So there used to be a concept of level 1 and level 2 service provider, and there is sort of that still, but it's changed a lot, and a lot of people don't know that. And the level 1 and level 2 for service providers, the threshold has been 300,000 transactions. So, if you're a service provider dealing with a level 1 or 2 merchant, you're sort of automatically a level 1 service provider. But they specify if you're seeing or storing the PAN, the account number. Other organizations that are just passing through, they don't really see the card data, the PAN in particular. They're not storing it, they're not saving it. They're more likely to only be on the hook for doing a self-assessment questionnaire. There's like a dozen different categories right now with different permutations because there's so many different types of organizations that are involved and fit this category of service provider.
Okay.
That's interesting.
I've got a question for you about PCI 4.0 and really the transition to it. What part of this is going to totally screw people up? What changes have been made that is going to make people go, oh, we're screwed, or oh my God, that's going to be a problem, or oh, I've got to spend an extra $100,000 a year or something? What's because there's been some significant damn changes in 4.0.
Well, there are, and for the service providers that are doing the SAQ, and they're having somebody like me, a QSA, help them fill it out. The SAQD for a service provider now requires a comment for every single requirement. How was this requirement tested? How was it validated? So it's very much like a ROC. In theory, you've always gone through the exercise, but in the past,
what's a ROC? What's a ROC?
I'm sorry, a ROC is a report on compliance. So that's the full 440 requirements with an explanation by me, writing down how I validated that the entity, the merchant or service provider, is meeting the requirement. So I interviewed people, I reviewed their documentation, I examined their systems, looked at configurations, looked at rule sets and so on and so forth, looked at the outputs. Are they doing things? Are they getting monthly, daily, weekly reports? Are they acting upon it? Are they doing, it's the whole enchilada. The implication for self-assessment questionnaires has always been the entity does all that, but the proof is simply checkbox.
Right.
But for service providers now, you no longer get to just check the box and say you're doing it. You have to have an explanation of how it was tested. How did you validate that? Not as full blown, perhaps, as a report on compliance, but it's got to be something that's decent enough that anybody that's going to do a quality assurance review is going to say, okay, yeah, you did what you're supposed to be doing. You've demonstrated compliance. And this goes to overall in version 4, the council really tried to eliminate as many of the loopholes that people have discovered over the years that allow them to sort of dodge doing the requirements, doing scope reduction. Huge exercise of PCI is how do I reduce scope? How do I make this go away? And there's companies that offer services and offer products that help you navigate that and ease your burden of compliance or make PCI compliance simple. So to answer your question, Josh, that's one big change. If you're a service provider doing the self-assessment questionnaire, and you're having me do it, you're going to be paying more for that than what you ordinarily did, because it takes a lot of time to write out a comment that's relevant for 440 requirements. That just takes time. Other big changes that are coming are, it used to be if you're doing any kind of e-commerce, you could either validate the security of the website using a WAF or doing some sort of web app testing.
Right.
This is future dated. You get most of these things that are new are going to be future dated. You get a year grace period, but WAFs are now becoming required. Period.
Oh, really?
That's interesting.
Yeah. Yep.
So wait. So as an e-commerce website, I'm going to be required to have a WAF.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's interesting. And Perv is rubbing their hands together greedily, happily. So
and there, it used to be confusing because there was web application security testing, which was the either or, and that's in requirement 6 dot something. And all the numbers have changed, by the way, so I don't even begin to know what the new numbers are. But there was also still in requirement 11, the penetration testing, which was supposed to be network and application level testing. So in the future, all the testing is in requirement 11, and it's all associated with the pen test, which is including application level as well as network level testing, internally and externally. Another change, since we're in requirement 11, is internal vulnerability scanning is going to have to be done, credentialed or authenticated. Different nice. Vendors call it different things, but they're requiring credentialed scans, which for most vendors that offer these things, it's more of a configuration check as much as a vulnerability check. So a truer result. But if you've never run one, you might be surprised the first time you do an authenticated scan.
Yeah, but wait, back up a step. How many companies have you run into? When I know this is anecdotal, but how many companies have you run into that you've gone and they've gone, oh yeah, we've never done an internal auth scan, an internal vuln scan with authentication. Like
the larger ones, the level ones, typically all do it at this point because the vendors have successfully sold them on it.
Okay,
but that's 1% of the companies that have to do PCI. Everybody else, not so much, because most companies operate on what's the least amount of work, what's the least amount of expense that I have to go through to get this thing over with, to make it go away. So authenticated scans cost more because they find more issues that have to be resolved. And there are literally companies out there that don't want to find the vulnerabilities because if they find them, they have to do something about them.
Well, that's with any regulatory compliance standard. You're going to have that. It's just the nature of it, right? You're going to have a certain percentage of the population that has to be compliant that goes, I just want to do the bare minimum, right? And there's been a lot of criticism for PCI for that behavior, but it is what it is. We can work to change their mindset, but
PCI, the council's been aware of that for a long time, and they've done as much, I think, as they can to try to minimize, as I said, the loopholes that allow companies to sort of skate through. But there's still issues. I was having a conversation with someone in the last day or two talking about the problems with PCI. One of the big problems with PCI is a lot of the payment processors and gateways, the providers of payment devices, and whether it's an e-commerce, whether it's a payment checkout page, and I won't name names at this point, or the devices that, you go into a mom and pop shop, a local restaurant, they've got payment terminals, somebody's providing them to them. That the devices themselves are supposed to be certified through the
Mhm.
council, through other standards and regulatory things that they do for specific things. But the companies largely themselves, the providers of the devices and the payment instruments, largely are unregulated. Surprisingly enough, they don't have to go
Hmm.
through training. They don't have to go through certifications. They can basically say what they want and get away with it. And, they're trying to sell stuff, obviously, and they're trying to do the right thing, but they don't always get it. I mean, I've got a client right now that's using a third party, you know, payment type solution
Mhm.
for their e-commerce. And if you go to this third party site, you can find a page that says we're PCI compliant. But if you ask them for the evidence, the attestation of compliance, which is what is made available for sharing for your customers, they aren't giving it up. And as far as I can tell, they don't have one. And
Mhm.
and my client has been talking to them. He CCs me on the emails, and he's been polite, but he's like, no, you really should have this. This is, you claim to be PCI compliant. You're sort of required to provide the evidence of that.
Right.
Um,
Because in this case, that service provider is uh, collecting payment card information.
right.
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 And they're not even doing it with the redirect or the iframe. They're collecting it because we've looked at the payment page and looked at the source code,
Mhm.
using the web server tools, and they're collecting the data and then transferring it. So they're absolutely transmitting and processing this
Right.
data, which means it could be stolen. Which means not only are they on the hook for, and they should be PCI compliant, they should be doing the full Monty. If they've
Yeah,
got
yeah.
more than one customer like this, they should have me as a QSA coming in and doing a rock for them.
I'm looking at some of the requirements for PCI 4.0, and I remembered something. MFA, multi-factor authentication, is massively upgraded in 4.0, right? And they're basically, it's not that you should do MFA, it's you will do MFA, and it's going to be everybody's going to do MFA now.
Yep.
And
pretty much.
I worked with a company recently that had a call center that was taking orders, order takers. And
Right.
they had the thing where they shut off. So they hit a button. I'm going to ask you for your credit card number. I'm going to hit the button,
Right.
but don't tell me until I tell you. They hit the button, say, go ahead, the credit card number. The recording stops for the credit card number. Then they turn the recording back on. That's how they don't record the credit card number into the call recording system.
Right.
But the problem was that I sent them to a QSA was they're like, we have to MFA into that system now. And we don't even know which systems we need to multi-factor into. They were so confused. Right. And I said, look, while I can sit down and talk with you, I need to send you to a QSA to deal with that. And, but call centers they're having major problems, and it's upgrading their costs significantly. I mean, this is going to cost people a lot more money.
Yeah, the call center issue isn't new necessarily, other than the typical call center. They're taking information over the phone and they're typing it into some sort of application, whether it's web based or whether it's a proprietary application. And it's been long recognized that because this call may be recorded for quality assurance purposes, that translates to you're capturing card data and you're storing it. A big issue for that has always been if you're giving up the security code, the 3 digits off the back of the card, you're not allowed to keep that, period, even if it's encrypted. So, the first problem with call centers is stripping that out. So that's why very commonly you've got the pause feature,
on the recording,
suppression, so it's not being captured. But the other issue is, how is that information coming in over the phone? Are you using a VoIP system? Most companies are using VoIP these days. That's network traffic,
right?
And because typically most companies are segmenting their environment, so the call center's in a segmented, isolated subnet of some sort, but the virtual the VoIP call trunk, or I don't know all the technical terms for the old analog PBXs, the phones, routers and switches. That could be anywhere in the company's network, and that traffic needs to be encrypted if it's traversing part of your network that you're not trusting because it's outside of your zone, which by the way is called a cardholder data environment, or CDE. A lot of companies don't think about doing that, and it's a pretty easy fix to, it's just a configuration to switch to turn on the encrypted. I think the protocol is called SIP in most cases.
Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, this all started with multi-factor authentication. That is pretty much required everywhere by everybody. It used to be just admins. It used to be just non-console access, and now it's everybody everywhere, other than the consumer. The consumer is not multi-factoring in necessarily. Still a best
Would you
practice,
like to buy that?
But it's
would
not
you like to
a
buy
PCI
that
requirement.
Would you like to buy that $3 piece of crap you have to multi-factor into?
Right. But
that wouldn't work.
along with that, PCI ran into problems a long time ago. And in fact, I was listening. John Strand actually did his podcast on PCI. I think it was back in February. I only saw it like a month ago. I'm like, damn, I wish he would have invited me. But he was actually giving PCI props for doing so much to improve. One of the things he pointed out was they finally upped the minimum password length to 12, where it's for years it's been 7. And of course, now there's a lot of systems that have been used for years and years within the payment system that might be capped at 7 or 8 characters, and there's going to be challenges with that. But what PCI says is, if you're relying on single authentication because of legacy systems or whatever, you can't invoke the multi-factor. You got to do 12 characters. But if you are doing multi-factor, they sort of relax some of the password requirements, like the length and the expiration in particular. Because NIST came out how many years ago and said, size matters. Password length is much more important than changing it every 90 days.
Yeah.
And really you're shooting yourself in the foot. Most security professionals agree. Don't change your really, really good long random password every 90 days. You're just creating the potential for problems.
That's NIST 866, I think, or 88, I forget. But and it was a few years ago.
I can't keep track. Yeah.
I know.
It's 800 something.
I want to go back to the devices. So if I'm a manufacturer and I make a payment card terminal, and it's kind of an outdated term, right? Because
this is for
a lot of the point of sale systems that I've seen, being friendly with people who own cigar lounges and bars, right? And then they all tell me the woes of their point of sale systems, and so some are like iPad based, some are computer based. Like there's all different kinds of hardware, if you will. So does that hardware and software and/or firmware on these devices, that has to be certified to a standard that's defined by the PCI Council? Can you talk a little bit about that? That's interesting.
Yeah, and there's quite a few depending on what they are. Now, in theory, the terminology, just to get it right, the point of sale system is what we would consider going into a grocery store or a department store is the cash register, but nobody calls it a cash register anymore. But historically, it was the PC that the clerk is looking at the screen and typing things in. And the payment terminal, what I'm referring to as the payment terminal, is the thing that me as a consumer is presenting my card to. In the old days, it was swipe, then it was dip, and now it's tap. Although technically you don't have to tap it. It's a proximity thing. And I try not to tap it just because I'm a geek. But that technically is
I'm sorry. So far he said that size matters and he tries not to tap it because he's a geek. So I'm just going to leave those hanging there.
Yep. We're just going to leave those innuendos hanging out there.
Thank you. I don't want germs. That payment terminal technically is called a point of interaction, or POI system. But payment terminal is sort of the generic term. And those, as well as the software that runs in the point of sale system, which takes the data from the card reader, which historically is plugged into a USB port, or if it's older, it's a serial port, and it's just really an ancillary device attached to a PC. The the software that's running on the point of sale system has to be certified, and the devices themselves have to be certified. Now, very common, and again, with the goal of making PCI less painful for merchants, is the idea that you do some form of encryption as soon as the card data is presented, whether it's tapped or dipped. And so there's a whole program which is called point-to-point encryption in PCI speak that gets certified. And basically, the keys are all embedded, they're injected into these devices, and the merchants have no access. So they're never seeing unencrypted payment data, and it goes right through their systems onto the payment processors, which decrypt it and send it on to the card brands for authorization. That is sort of the holy grail for retail merchants, for brick and mortar card present merchants. Now, but there's a problem with that too, because there's a lot of providers that do the encryption, but for whatever reason haven't gone through the certification program. So PCI calls those end-to-end encryption. Same principles apply, but they don't technically have the certification. So technically they're not supposed to fill out the short form that they're eligible for.
So who certifies the hardware and software?
There are I work for a QSA company. There's other companies that get different certifications that make them qualified to do the assessments and the testing and the certification.
So it's a separate. If I want to provide a certification for hardware and software that's going to accept credit cards, I need a separate certification from the PCI Council to be one of the entities that can certify them. I got you.
Correct. Yeah, and there's lots of different.
What are those called? Are those called something? Are those called something? What are those called?
I figured you were going to ask me that. I would have to look it up, which I can do while we're talking.
Sure.
I mean, there is a separate QSA qualification, special training to validate point-to-point encryption. So it's a QSA-P2PE, for example. But I got to do something with the cookies. There's
also a separate one for forensics. So there's QSA forensic for after an incident.
PCI forensics investigators is a certification. Secure software lifecycle assessors, secure software assessors. Those are the people that look at the code that's running in the payment systems, the point of sale systems. Qualified PIN assessors. If you're using a debit cards historically are a different payment path because they're going to a different part of the bank type of thing. And if you're using a PIN to authorize, that's also a separate thing that gets looked at. And so there's a certification for that. So, and then there's the point-to-point encryption assessors. There's also some limited certification for some of the organizations, like a qualified integrator and reseller. That's a certification. That's the organizations that would go to your cigar shop and sell them the little device.
Right. Yeah, because it typically comes from a reseller.
Right.
Gotcha.
And that's where the training and the awareness tends to tail off, because you've got people that are like, well, I can sell you this device and we're going to charge you half a penny less per transaction, so it'll be worth your while to switch. Right. That's kind of where their motivation is. I mean, even the approved scanning vendor you mentioned earlier, that's a separate certification. You and I used to work for Tenable. Tenable had to go through a certification process.
I remember that process
to get their actual, not just the scan program, but the policy that was that Tenable's Nessus's terminology, the scan policy.
Scan policy. Yep.
It had to be certified that it's catching enough things.
Yep.
And Renault used to get very frustrated
because
his opinion of what was an issue was not necessarily the council's idea of what's an issue. But typically they're looking mostly for OWASP top 10 type of stuff, plus whatever's hot and being exploited. I mean, which is one of the reasons why they've added ASV scans to look for the security of the web servers, so that so there can't be the hijacking type of attacks. which I think is a good thing, because
I think so too. Yeah.
We've gotten to the point, and I've had customers that have e-commerce sites that outsource the hosting of it,
Mhm.
outsource the application development and maintenance and life cycle. That's another third party. And then they do the payment, checkout, iframe. So that's yet another third party. And yet they're the merchant on the hook for it. And I'm like, so who's doing the basic security of any of this?
Mm.
And there's a lot of, well,
Finger
that's somebody
pointing, yeah.
else's problem. That's not my problem. And I'm like, yeah, but you're the merchant at the end of the day. You might want to think about doing that, doing more. And that's
Mhm.
something that the new SAQA is pushing these types of merchants towards, is there's more. The idea of a short form in the self-assessment questionnaire is they only give you the requirements that apply
Gotcha.
to fill out. You know, if you're just doing e-commerce, you don't have a whole bunch of network, you don't have a bunch of servers, you don't have a bunch of databases, especially if you're doing the redirect. So you don't need to worry about all that kind of stuff. There's requirements that have to do about the physical security inspection of the payment terminals in a retail location, and that still exists even if it's a terminal that's point-to-point encryption. They want you to, in each store location, look at it to look for tampering, to look for skimmers, looking for extra wires or antennas and stuff like that, because that, you know, if there's encryption going on, there's only one of two places to attack, and that's the point of introduction.
Right.
Get the card data before it's entered into the secure device, or on the other end when it's being decrypted, and presumably that's at a very secure facility and harder to get to. So, you know, what's the most common payment card attack these days? Skimmers. Skimmers at the small stores that nobody cares about, that are self-assessing. I have a debit card. I only use my debit card to get cash out of the credit union. I usually do that in the drive-through. Last year I went to Canada and I used an ATM to just get Canadian currency. So I had some walking around money. Week later, I'm getting a notice that my debit card got popped. So very clearly there was a skimmer, or somebody was intercepting the video that was necessarily on that thing. And this was in the Toronto International Airport. So, you know,
well, it's a good place to put a skimmer, you know, widely used, hotly used.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the bad guys go through their risk analyses too. What's the best bang for the buck? But, you know, it's uncommon, you know, knock on wood, that retailers are getting knocked over, because they mostly don't save the data anymore. So you're not stealing 10, 20, 30 million cards at a pop, because the merchants finally figured out they don't need to keep it, which is a good thing. Payment processors, the ones that aggregate all this information, they need to be the next best target, but they're the ones that are focusing more of the security things and doing the right things. But what gets neglected is all the little guys. And the little guys can even be franchises of name brands that you recognize, but they're individually owned and operated. And because of that, they're still considered a small merchant doing the self-assessment, and are largely ignored, and therefore more likely targets. And the bad guys have figured out, you know, skimming cards, you know, a couple dozen times here and there, but at 100 different stores, you know, it still adds up.
Right.
They don't, you know, and that continues to this day.
Do you find that organizations implement a software solution to help them with the compliance, right? Because I think Matt works for a company, and we interviewed someone that helps with compliance, and it's a software solution, right? That as you go is helping you keep compliant. Is that something you recommend?
I'm really torn on this one. You know, most of the requirements in PCI are, well, I should say half of the PCI requirements are, do you have documentation? Do you have a policy and procedure in place?
Right.
When you get down to the technical controls, which are, you know, roughly half of the requirements, most of them are, you know, met by using some sort of tool, you know, what we commonly refer to as solutions, but I don't like that word. And they're mostly point solutions. There's very rare will one type of solution sweep up a whole lot of things? But what you're talking about, and sort of in the category of a GRC type of solution, is in terms of keeping track of all the evidence that you have to produce on an annual basis to prove that you're capturing logs immediately and transferring them and reviewing them daily and doing other things weekly and doing other things monthly and doing other things quarterly, and you have to amass all this evidence. That's where tools come into play that can help you collect all that data. My concern, though, is that compliance and internal audit offices, or GRC offices in organizations that do this, they become the ones that are in charge of proving compliance. But to me, I should still be talking to the admins and the developers and the people that are responsible for this stuff. But everybody gets reliant in, all I do is talk to the auditors, and very briefly do I talk to the people that I really want to talk to, because I'm a security professional. I want to come in and make sure that you're doing the right thing, and not just going through a paper pushing process. And that's one of my grievances with the evolution of PCI. It's becoming more and more like an audit process where the job becomes just producing a whole lot of paperwork and product and evidence, and the what you're trying to do and accomplish, I think, often gets lost, or at least it's harder to demonstrate that you're really clueful and doing the right things.
How should we fix that?
That's a great question. Eliminate all GRC offices and make everybody that's already busy in terms of admins and security professionals and administrators and developers and DBAs do all this extra stuff.
No, look, seriously, I'm actually serious. I'm actually serious. How should we fix it?
I'm kind of serious too.
You can't eliminate GRC. There has to be a process, because without GRC, the security people don't do it right. End of story. Okay. We have found that if you deregulate, guess what happens? They fuck it up. So in the spirit of DFIU, what can we do to make it so that there is a paperwork process? Because there's certain paperwork policies you have to have. I mean, we both agree on that, I would assume. And that there's also a technical process where you can actually assess and just determine the validity, veracity, adequacy, and sufficiency of the technical aspects of this audit process. Would you split them up into two processes, two types of QSAs? What would you do?
No, I think the way that the PCI assessment process was set up actually is the best way to do it. Okay. But what's happened over the years is a tendency for me to talk more to the GRC folks and less to the admins and developers. I mean, they are important to be a watchdog, but keep doing the PCI assessment process, because there's requirements and this has been enforced. Well, this has been in the standard for quite a few years, that for every single requirement that's in all the different categories, I'm supposed to interview the people responsible for doing that and judge them on whether they know what they're doing. They've got the right kind of training. They got the right kind of certifications. And trust me, that's almost like a free pass, because who's going to fail somebody because you really don't know what you're talking about, and how do you prove that? But that's really the essence of, I need to, as the qualified security assessor who is the security expert. Of course, the other problem is QSAs aren't necessarily security experts these days. But
that's the problem.
I got to run. A big problem. All right. Thanks, Josh.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, I think we're getting ready to wrap. That was good stuff, Jeff. Any closing thoughts or final words on helping people navigate PCI?
I mean, the final thought is, 4.0 is here. You can't escape it. If you're needing to do it, get on top of it. Even if you have a grace period to do some of these new things, it's all stuff you should be doing anyway already. So get on it as soon as possible. And if you're needing to hire a QSA, go out and interview them. Don't go for the cheapest QSA necessarily. Go for one that's going to give you the best bang for the buck, quality. So look at the resumes. I'd say go to my company, but that would be too blatantly obvious. But my company does, and hopefully we can add it to the show notes. We do have the PCI 4 was announced in 2020, and then COVID happened and it got pushed out. So most of the people in our practice have had nothing to do but think about version 4 for the last couple of years. So we put together a pretty hefty resource center that has a lot of white papers, research papers, blogs, videos, seminars, webinars that just go over all of the details of what's new and what's coming and what you need to do to prepare for it. So it's actually a pretty decent resource. You should be aware of it by now. You shouldn't have waited this long to be ready for it. But as a security professional first, I think it's a good thing because it makes you think about all the things that you should be doing from a security perspective. It's why I endorse PCI as a framework for anybody that has a security issue at all. And, you don't have to do the NIST cybersecurity frameworks. You don't have to do the 800-whatever series. There's something that PCI has been around for 20 years and it's made significant changes in the industry. I mean, merchants and retailers aren't getting popped anymore and losing tens of millions of cards because they don't have them anymore. Now they got rid of them to minimize their PCI, but the net effect was they reduced the footprint of where you could steal card data, because in the early days it was everywhere.
Yes.
And now it's harder to find. But the game has changed and the bad guys are looking at different things and coming up with different ways. I didn't address it earlier, but I should mention before we go that there's a lot more focus on updating the terminology and the requirements to make it more relevant to today's architectures and technology, meaning there's a lot more cloud specific stuff. So you can't just say, well, we don't have a firewall anymore. We're serverless. All we have is, security rules and software in the cloud. I'm like, well, that's what we're talking about. So they've updated the language. They don't call it firewalls and routers and switches anymore. They call it network. I'm not going to remember the exact term, but network devices or security devices. So they've tried to, again, eliminate the loopholes from people saying, well, we don't technically have a firewall, so we don't technically need to do anything.
I gotcha.
And you'd think that wouldn't be a thing, but it is. So everybody's looking for that. How do we minimize this? How do we make it go away? How do we reduce our costs?
Awesome.
Do it right in the first place,
and
do things securely. If you think it's secure, I as a QSA can help you find it. And the standard now allows, as I said, with the customized approach, they're like, fine, if you want to do something slightly different than what we call for, great, just back it up and have your own testing criteria and we're good. So it's very, I always get into arguments with people on whether it's too strenuous and picky and specific versus it's kind of vague and open and lets you do what you want. I'm sort of in the category of, it's pretty open and lets you do what you want. You have to have a build standard, but it can be your build standard, and not anybody else's. There's so many other. One last thing. They've sort of eliminated the need for an annual risk assessment. They've replaced it with what they're calling a targeted risk analysis, and that is required for a bunch of different things, mostly concerning how often you do things. Best example is if you have scan results. The requirement, let's say for an internal scan, is you have to address all the high risk or critical vulnerabilities, mediums and lows and informational. Get around to them whenever. Now PCI is saying you need to have a plan for dealing with the mediums and lows and informational. It can be 60 days, 90 days, 100 days, whatever. But whatever you come up with, a number has to be based on a targeted risk analysis, which is making you make a real evaluation. And really, how often do we need to do this? That's part of something called a targeted risk analysis. And that's more homework, and at least up front. But it's again, I'm trying to eliminate vulnerabilities. And I mean, this is something that Strand was saying on his podcast. As a pen testing company, they don't need a high risk or critical vulnerability. And we've talked about how many times they're exploited in the first place, but string together a couple mediums and lows and informational, and that gets you in. So you do have to address them. They are important. So more legwork, more work to do, but it's all to make you more secure, and you should be doing it anyway. It's just PCI is finally holding your feet to the fire.
Awesome, Jeff. Thank you so much.
I'll leave it at that.
Sounds good. Thank you. Coming up next, Win Schwartau. Stay tuned.